You are listening to KSG Podcast. This is a short, crisp, concise, exam-oriented edited editorial for civil services aspirants. In this podcast, we are going to talk about what does GDP second advance estimate means. The source for the content is Udit Mishra's article for the Indian Express. On 28th of February 2022, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, that is MOSPI, released the second advanced estimates, that is SAEs, of GDP for the current financial year. These are an update over the first advanced estimates released on 7 January 2022. The key difference between the two is that the SAEs are arrived at by incorporating the GDP data for Q3, that is the third quarter, October to December. Now, how many revisions of GDP estimates are done and why? For each financial year, say 2021 to 2022, the GDP estimates go through several rounds of revisions. Each year, on 7th of January, MOSPI releases the FAEs. Then, in the February end, after incorporating the quarter 3 data, came the SAEs. By May end come the provisional estimates after incorporating the quarter 4, that is January to March data. Then in end January 2023, MOSPI will release the first revised estimates for financial year 2022. These will be followed by the second revised estimates, that is by Jan end 2024, and the third revised estimates by Jan end 2025. Each revision benefits from more data, making the GDP estimates more accurate and robust. What is the highlight in the SAE? If the concern was whether India's economic recovery in financial year 2022, after the slump in financial year 2021 due to COVID, is good enough for overall GDP to scale back the pre-COVID level, that is financial year 2020, then the SAEs do not provide any picture. However, the SAEs present a completely different picture of the nature of India's economic recovery from the one presented by the FAEs. Now, how are the two pictures different? Before going into that, it is necessary to understand that India's overall GDP has three main engines of growth. The biggest is private final consumption expenditure, that is PFCE, the money that everyone spends in their personal capacity and accounts for over 55% of GDP. The second biggest is the money spent by private firms towards increasing productive capacity. This is investment expenditure, shown as gross fixed capital formation, that is GFCF. It accounts for around 33% of GDP. Then comes the money spent by governments towards their consumption, as against their investments. This is the government financial consumption expenditure, that is GFCE. Now, based on FAEs, the key observations about the nature of India's recovery were: number one, overall GDP was expected to go past the pre-COVID level. Number two, recovery was driven by higher investments, as evidenced by the spike in GFCF. Number three, the main worry was poor levels of PFCE, which was well below the pre-COVID levels, an effect of the K-shaped recovery. The same held true for per capita personal expenditure as well as per capita GDP or income. The argument was, yes, overall GDP is likely to be back at pre-COVID levels, but private income and expenditures are far below pre-COVID levels. This will imply weak consumer demand and before long rob businesses of the incentive to continue investing. But the altered distribution of the subcontinents has changed the evolving story. Even though overall GDP and per capita GDP, that is income, have not changed much, PFCE and per capita PFCE have jumped. GFCE and GFCF show a commensurate decline in SAEs. Overall, all components are above the pre-COVID level and they are being led by private demand, which augurs well for the future. Now, how did so much change in a month? Pranab Sen, former chief statistician of India, pointed to the inadequacy of data while making the FAEs. He said, and I quote, "You must understand that there are no independent estimates on the expenditure side," pointing to the fact that what MOSPI collects is data on gross value added, or the production side of the economy. The GDP estimates are arrived at by adding up the expenditure. He said that what MOSPI does is that it takes the production side data and they classify goods and services as either consumption goods or investment goods. Now, is that the final picture? No, said Sen. He says that during times of such upheavals, revisions are extremely important. We are still working with incomplete information. For instance, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs data will become available only in the second revised estimates, that is, January end 2024. As things stand, if one looks at this GDP data with other estimates, such as those of unemployment, one could argue that the upper arm of the K has done better than what was previously imagined. That's it for this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. To join KSG India courses and to crack the ICE exam, visit ksgindia.com. You can also get a PDF of this podcast on ksgindia.com.